the passing or at least the stability of coalitions going forward, because what we have at a local level cannot be replicated on a national level. And so we've set out five primary intentions in our discussion document, which will be the basis of these three pieces of legislation that we want to bring to Parliament. Number one, it is to set an electoral threshold. To implement an electoral threshold that is either between 1 or 2%, pending consultation with political parties. The reason that we've stated this is a pending discussion, is because, of course, as many of you know, there are many parties in South Africa's political landscape, and we want to gain and garner the views of these political parties to make sure that whatever is in the final piece of legislation is something that also considers the presence of these political parties, but also prioritizes stability. And this is why we have elected to say that it's quite important to introduce the issue of an electoral threshold. In many, many countries, including Germany, including Denmark, including Belgium, and all these other countries where coalition governments have become the norm, they have introduced thresholds that are differing. Whether it's in Denmark, which is 2%, whether it's in Germany at a national level, which is 5%, all of these thresholds are, in our view, a way in which we can stabilize coalition governments so that we do not have a fragmentation of the political system where parties that have only garnered less than 1% of the vote often act as kingmakers, and they often are one vote or one seat away from destabilizing an entire government. And while this is not, we obviously recognize that electoral thresholds will involve trade-offs. The Constitution makes it quite clear. Section 46 of the Constitution says that the Constitution specifies that elections must result in general in proportional representation. So, of course, the introduction of electoral thresholds is a trade-off with that. But our view is that if you set the threshold between 1 and 2%, that in fact you will achieve what the Constitution seeks to do. But at the same time ensuring that there's stability within coalition governments, particularly at a provincial and a national one. And so the second part of our proposals here is that we would like the coalition agreements to be formalized and in some instances codified to avoid conflict, to avoid disruptions, and to avoid instability. The concept of public coalition agreements is something that should be very much part and parcel of coalition politics in South Africa. Of course, the DA, when we entered into the negotiations agreements in 2021, we undertook to publicize our coalition agreements, but we're of the view that this should be mandatory so that it can hold political parties account against their own agreement that they have signed up to. Coalitions across all spheres of government should reflect the party's genuine commitment to this multi-party government that they want to be part of. Currently, there is no legislation that regulates coalitions, that stipulates what should be in the agreements. And so often what you see, these are just simply agreements that parties can often pull out of on a whim. As we've seen in the city of Johannesburg, a party can, for various reasons, decide to pull out of a coalition agreement. Our view is that if you formalize these coalition agreements and you create the legal framework under which they can exist, parties will be far more at pains to be able to simply pull out and destabilize an entire government. Which is what brings me to my next point, the third element of our proposal, which is the establishment of an independent registrar of political parties. In Kenya, for instance, the Political Act of 2007 in Kenya has established exactly this, where there is the Political Parties Act of 2007, where there is a political registrar. Our view here is that the political registrar will act as an independent, completely removed custodian of coalition agreements. So you've got codified, formalized coalition agreements to which parties are party to, and that they have signed and they've committed, and that is publicized. The registrar's job would be essentially to become the custodian of those agreements, so that we can make sure that these agreements are not the subject of disruptions or disputes between political parties, that somehow you also take the politicization of these agreements from being, the initiation or the initiative of one political party. This is an agreement that is completely removed from political parties that they are party to, and the registrar becomes the custodian of this. And we are of the view that this registrar will entrench public accountability, because, for instance, if a political party wishes to no longer be part of a coalition government, they would make their reasons known. But of course, these can't be arbitrary. These have to be explicitly stated that there is a provision in the coalition agreement that has been triggered, and this is the reason why they no longer wish to be part of the coalition agreement. This is important because, of course, political conversations change, but this cannot be at the detriment of citizens that we're trying to serve. Ultimately, what we're trying here to do is to make sure that coalition governments that are formed put the citizens first and make sure that governance is prioritized, and that you don't have a coalition government that is in place for 6 months and then they are threatened for removal on nefarious reasons. And then the fourth element that we are wishing to introduce with these pieces of legislation is the extending of time period for the election of mayors and premiers. Currently, the Municipal Structures Act states that municipalities have about 14 days to formulate a government from the time that an election is declared. Our view is that if we're going to have meaningful discussions and negotiations at this level, you've got to extend that. You look at countries like Germany that took months to negotiate a government. While we are not obviously advocating for that, because that in itself has unintended consequences, the reality is that the 2-week time frame is way too short, and we've got to look at extending that so that, firstly, the political registrar can make sure that parties that are party to that agreement have done what is necessary. They've publicized on their side the agreement that political parties are party to, and that this is now something that they are committed to, and these are the agreements that they've committed to. And so we are of the view that 14 days is not enough, and that we are looking to extend the time that particularly local governments have to establish a government, and also provincial and national governments, so that to give parties sufficient time to make meaningful negotiations in this regard. And then the last element is the limitation of motions of no confidence. Of course, with consultation with other parties, the DA will be investigating the possibility of introducing a measure which would limit the frequency of motions of no confidence. This, of course, this element was brought in bearing in mind the Mazibuko case versus Sisulu in the Constitutional Court, in which it dealt with the issue around motions of no confidence, how and who can bring motions of no confidence in the National Assembly. And so we are of the view that if we are going to revisit this, we would need to change sections 102 and 141 of the Constitution, where we would have a consultation with political parties about how frequent can political parties bring motions of no confidence in either councils, legislatures, or in the National Assembly. Again, this is not to curtail people's ability to be able to remove or hold account a government that is no longer performing, but it's also to say that it's important to give people, whoever they are, an ability to set up a budget and deliver against that budget. Again, this is also steered towards making sure that these coalition governments are stable and that they serve the residents that have elected us. And so these legislative changes would be implemented through the introduction of 3 separate bills in our view. The first bill will seek to amend the Electoral Act. Of course, we have a conundrum on our hands where there is the Electoral Amendment Bill before Parliament, which has its own process that is ongoing. We are not of the view that Parliament is going to be able to meet the deadline for 2024. And what we don't want is a situation where we get to the eve of 2024 and we have no legislative or legal framework whatsoever to govern a real possibility of a national coalition government or even at provinces. And so the timelines around this first bill will need to be really looked against what this electoral amendment bill and the process that it is following, because it obviously will have great impact on that. The second bill will seek to amend the existing Local Government Municipal Structures Act, and this will be undertaken with normal times. There's no need for us to wait for any outcomes on this, and we're of the view again that we can make some key changes there, looking at the frequency of motions of no confidence, of course looking at the Constitution and whether that's compliant, but also looking at extending the time that it would take for local governments to formulate governments. And then the third bill would seek to amend the Constitution, because we need to look at regulating the frequency of motions of no confidence. That in itself needs to be something that we've got to look into the Constitution, because of course the provisions of the Constitution, I think it must be section 102 if I'm not mistaken. Sorry? Yes, Section 102 makes provision for motions of no confidence in the National Assembly, and Section 141 makes provision for motions of no confidence in the provincial legislatures. And so we need to look at this bill in making sure that can we amend the section of the Constitution to allow for us to introduce, or at least to amend that section to talk about the frequency of motions of no confidence and extend the time it takes for a government to be formulated after the declaration of an election. And so, colleagues, these are our 5 proposals. The one is about setting the electoral threshold to make sure that we've got stability in governments at local, provincial, and at national level. It is to make sure that, while it's not to try to keep people out, it's to make sure that the fragmentation of our political system does not disadvantage the people who rely on government services the most. We've seen it, as international best practice has shown, that thresholds are important in keeping stability, but also they're in line with our Constitution. And when the Constitution speaks about general proportionality, we are able to meet that with the introduction of electoral thresholds. Number 2, formalizing coalition agreements. One thing we have learned as a political party, and we learned a very harsh lesson, is that not all parties treat coalition agreements the same way. That not all parties treat the agreements to be binding in the same way. And so we've got to codify these, we've got to formalize these, and they need to be within a legal framework. And then number 3 is to make sure that we establish an independent registrar for political parties. What we've also seen as a harsh lesson on our side is that negotiating with political parties, that's a political process that nobody can do, but politicians. But the management, the maintenance, and the adjudication of the coalition agreements and tie-breaking mechanisms and dispute resolutions needs to be done by an independent registrar that is not actively involved, or at least that does not stand to gain from either being in government or not being in government. That's what we've seen in the Kenyan model, and we're of the view that it would work. And then fourthly, extending the time for the election of premiers, presidents, and mayors. Lastly, looking with other political parties whether or not we can introduce a limitation on the frequency of motions of no confidence. Again, seeking to make sure that there is stability. And then we want to do these through using 3 different pieces of legislation that we believe we can get there.
I think in setting out these proposals, we really hope to try and establish a broad political and civil society conversation and support for the legislative changes. We believe these are essential if we're going to have stable coalition politics going forward in South Africa. We believe that this matter is urgent and crucial for a prosperous, united South Africa. This is not a conversation which we're going to be able to have in the 14 days that follow the 2024 election. It's going to require us to understand that the legislative and political framework is going to have to adapt to the reality that South Africa now finds itself in as it starts to head towards coalition country. The absence of legislation to govern coalitions, we believe, is an omission. We believe that after 70-odd years of one-party domination, the country has not sufficiently prepared itself legislatively or politically for the era of coalitions, which is why we end up with so much of the instability that we see, which gives coalitions a bad name, when in fact there are successful forms of government in other parts of the world where they bring stability, progress, development, and advancement of people. But they will require a framework for that to take place in. And we hope to get today that conversation started here in Parliament, but certainly we invite a broader conversation with civil society bodies, other political parties, and other political formations who may not be parties, about how they best see this legislation and this legislative framework serving the interests of solid, stable government that serves the interests of the people of South Africa and not the politicians. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks. Look, the most important thing is there is across the board recognition that coalitions are the future of governance in our country, and whether we've got any strong views about how they are currently effective or otherwise, there is a legislative lacuna that we are trying to address with these proposals that we are bringing to the table. And the DA, obviously, as the official opposition here in Parliament, we are going to anchor that process. But as John says, it is important that this is as inclusive as possible. That's why that engagement of seeking support through the discussions with other political parties and civil society is very important for us, because this is going to be a key ingredient for our democracy, and that is why the Chief Whip will be the anchor lead here in making sure that in terms of the parliamentary requirements, we lead that process. But we recognize that this requires, engagement with all the other stakeholders in society, and that's why we want to make this journey as inclusive as possible. On that light, colleagues, I know this is a very important conversation and one that you have obsessed about. Are there any questions from the House, or do you need time to prepare for them so that we can start with the online questions first? I see an eager one from there, and I see here 3. So let's start with the in-house ones, and then we'll take the online ones. Yeah. And let's just do the standard practice, because there are also people that are watching on our social media platforms. Indicate your name, your publication, and the question, and we'll get it rolling. Madam?
Marianne Merton, Daily Maverick. Quick question with regards to the independent regulator on political parties. Would you also want that to take over the party political funding issues, considering then you would have a one-stop shop kind of thing? The other thing about the motions of no confidence curtailment, are you not concerned that this will come and bite you in future, and is it not an overreach? Because at the moment, what we're seeing is the motion of no confidence at local government level. Are there not options within the municipal systems and other municipal legislation to deal with that in the sense of managing the instability rather than projecting into a constitutional amendment? Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Madam.
Monique Mortlock from the ENCA. You mentioned that bringing forward this legislation or these proposals, it's not a fix to DA problems, but one has to question the timing of you bring this briefing and bringing these pieces of legislation. And although you say it's proposals, I do have to ask, it seems that when the DA is in positions where its coalitions collapse, like we've seen in Joburg and now in Ekurhuleni, where the ANC is proposing a motion of no confidence against DA Mayor Tanya Campbell, then the DA wants to address the stability in coalitions, but when you have situations like in Nelson Mandela Bay a couple of weeks ago, where that coalition collapsing worked in the DA's favor, when did you decide to bring this legislation, these legislations? Is it because of what has transpired in Joburg, what is now happening in Ekurhuleni, or is this something that the DA has been looking at even before everything that we've seen happening in these different municipalities?
Cool. Is there another question in-house so that we can take all 3 before we go to the online ones?
SABC, have you engaged your coalition partners at